Welcome to today's webinar, Intelligent Forecasting in a New Era in Financial Planning for the CFO. This discussion, we will be focusing on not just the evolving role the CFO plays by employing external insights into the strategic planning process, but how finance executives can really span their organization to champion and introduce technology and data that can improve the methods each business unit leverages to plan, budget, and forecast. Hello, I'm Nicole Flynn. I work at Prevedere in corporate and partner marketing and have been doing so for several years. In my role, I have the distinct opportunity to work with our technology and other partnerships. Without them, we would not be able to provide a complete predictive forecasting solution to our clients. Prevedere is a leader in predictive analytics software that provides business leaders with real-time insights into their company's future performance. Working in the forefront of predictive forecasting technology is multifaceted, and many ways requires a community to build. So joining us today are two outstanding speakers to cover this topic. Both are highly regarded in their field. First, a warm welcome to Patrick Slattery. Patrick is the founder and managing director of Conopoc, a CFO advisory firm in New York. Patrick has over 20 years experience in leading and envisioning finance transformation initiatives, having worked as a partner at KPMG and Deloitte and as managing director at the Hackett Group. Patrick is also an adjunct professor at Fordham University Graduate School and a board member of InfraGard in New York, serving to raise awareness and increase protection of critical infrastructure. Thank you, Patrick, for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm looking forward to the discussion and being back together with Andrew again.
Excellent. What a great segue. Also joining us today is Andrew Duguay. Andrew served as chief economist at Prevedere. Prior to his role at Prevedere, Andrew was a senior economist at ITR Economics. Andrew's commentary and expertise have been featured in NPR, Reuters, and many other publications. Andrew has an MBA in economics. He's received a certificate in professional forecasting from the Institute of Business Forecasting and certificates in economic measurement, applied econometrics, and time series analysis and forecasting from the National Association of Business Economics. That was a mouthful, Andrew. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nicole. Happy to be back. Thank you.
Great. Well, with our intros made, let's jump in. Taking a quick look at today's agenda, we will be focusing on four major topics. To begin, we'll start with a discussion and consideration of the CFO as a technology enabler throughout the organization and how the role has fundamentally changed in recent years. From there, we'll segue into the value of advanced analytics and financial planning, which will lead nicely into a discussion on what intelligent forecasting is. And finally, how machine learning really is a force multiplier in finance. So maybe to begin, we should level set on what the CFO has done for planning and what the process looks like for the CFO, perhaps some best practices. Patrick, maybe this is a great opportunity for you to step in.
Well, certainly. When you consider the current state of practice in financial planning and analysis, which for most professionals is also their view of best practice, it's often the case that while processes have improved, information and technology lag. That's especially true for information. Take the DEMING cycle: plan, do, check, act, and then repeat. That entire process, which is considered best practice, typically relies on historical data and at best in the forecasting process, last month's actual data. The unfortunate truth is that most enterprises rely on stale information for financial planning and analysis. The best they can do is extrapolate internal historical data, regardless of whether that data is leading indicator or not. Each level of management can drive improvements in planning through the use of both internal and external data and an understanding of meaningful predictive indicators. This is especially true when markets reach an inflection point, either upward or downward, as valuable lead time can improve the impact of decision making. Marketing has known this for almost 75 years. Finance has yet to learn it. It works at each level: strategic planning, functional planning, and operational planning. And we'll explore that more in the rest of the webinar.
Oh, great. Thank you, Patrick. Especially like the analogy comparing the marketing insights and now kind of taking those insights and honing them in for the financial perspective for foresight. So Andrew, just carrying off that, this is a great moment to share how CFOs ingest analytics.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. So let's talk about what we mean by ingesting analytics. So when we look at the modern CFO and best practices in predictive analytics, we have to consider all the factors at play that could be impacting business performance conditions. Now, this is going to start to look a lot different than maybe what best practices were 10, 20 years ago. So let's talk about what are the factors that an executive, a CFO, should be looking at. So advanced analytics really means taking a data-driven approach to understanding business problems, looking more at many different potential causals to the business, and looking at more than ever before. So advanced analytics really means not only collecting and incorporating internal factors, the traditional marketing, promotions, distribution, factors that businesses pull to control their own destiny, but also incorporating the myriad of external factors that are influencing your business. Why is this important? Well, it's really a known fact that large companies are impacted by what goes on outside of their four walls. And it's actually cited as the #1 risk factor for many large companies is uncertain economic conditions. No longer can this just be an excuse of why we missed past performance, but the CFO really needs to be taking and incorporating with modern analytic technologies, incorporating and ingesting all these external factors and knowing which ones are the true drivers of their business and be able to see, knowing those factors, what is likely to change in their business around the corner.
And Andrew, to be fair to finance, I'd say historically, they may have agreed in concept with what you just said, but they didn't have the tools, and they certainly didn't have the computing power to do it efficiently.
Yeah, Patrick, I agree. And you know what? It's actually an exciting time where I sit as an economist because there's many different advancements right now in the forecasting and planning process to make this more systematic and make this more an incorporated part of the planning process. So in the world of economics, I think our engagement with the CFO was really that CFOs would be expected to read up on the Wall Street Journal, listen to economists and market analysts, and have a general understanding of what market conditions were doing. But then when it came to actually incorporating what those actual leading factors have in a quantifiable way impacted the business and which ones are predictive of a future downturn or upswing in the business, that's where predictive analytics is really making great strides and advancements. Because now there are real opportunities to incorporate new technology in such as machine learning to scour the world's data for leading data signals, measure the impact on the business, and incorporate those leading signals directly into the forecasting process rather than just anecdotally on the side. We know that when developing a business plan, millions of dollars are at stake. If we are not accurate, the business is not allocating resources efficiently. If a forecast is too high, you hold too much inventory, margins take a hit with discounting, and there could be extra storage costs. And then, of course, if a forecast is too low, you miss out on opportunities, lost sales, maybe giving up some market share, and potentially higher production costs, given you're not taking advantage of the full market. So forecast accuracy has always been a critical importance to the Office of Finance. I think with machine learning, what we're seeing is that businesses are actually making real progress in incorporating external factors to make forecasts more accurate.
And you know, Andrew, when you talk to many finance professionals about machine learning, it seems a black box to them. And one way I like to describe it, and I know in today's webinar, as we get into the Prevedere solution, it'll become clearer, is that oftentimes what we're doing with machine learning is something we would have considered doing if we could afford it with Excel and hundreds or thousands of analysts sitting at computers running Excel models. But we have the capacity now to do that sort of analysis at scale.
Patrick, excellent points. Andrew as well. So we're getting into intelligent forecasting organically here, but let's look into this a little bit more. And Andrew, perhaps you can give us a deeper look into intelligent forecasting. As we define it here, it's the ability to systemically identify and quantify the influence of economic factors on business outcomes. What does this actually mean?
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. So to me, intelligent forecasting is really about taking a more scientific approach to understanding what is driving the business. But importantly, and I think to your point, Patrick, doing it at the speed and scale required to be actionable and efficient with company resources. Right? If the analysis takes too long or costs too much, it's simply not worth doing. But with intelligent forecasting, really the design is that we can get quickly and efficiently to business answers, and therefore we can answer more questions. We don't need the 1,000 data scientists or analysts working in Excel anymore. So what makes intelligent forecasting better than traditional methods? Well, let's look at some of the metrics here. So first, intelligent forecasting starts with algorithms. So there are many new advanced predictive capabilities data scientists are implementing at scale over the last few years for businesses to decipher patterns, answer what happened, and importantly, answer what is next. With all the extra computing power available to data scientists today through cloud computing, we can ask more questions than ever for data and bigger questions. I like to start my executive deliveries when showing a predictive model I built by saying, hey, here's the final model. However, I ran 1,278 models to find you this particular best model. We can now do things like that, which were previously impossible and not worth the time. With advanced data science, predictive capabilities are more possible, and now you can get better answers. So this leads to the second point, is that the best algorithms are only as good as the data you feed them. And that is why it's important to have better forecasting data and better indicators in order to make good predictive decisions. I think the old adage is garbage in, garbage out. And if you only feed your models internal historic data, when you find unexplained holes and gaps, they're going to be lacking, especially if your business is subject to market conditions like most businesses are. This is where having holistic access to millions of external market factors are very important, because these market factors are also pushing and pulling your business alongside all the internal things that you're doing. So many companies are finding real value in tapping the world's external data in the scientific way, marrying that with their internal data to find the best predictors of business, no matter where those predictors lie, inside the business's four walls or outside in the broader world from different public and private data sources. You can then utilize machine learning and cloud computing to sift through potentially millions of relevant factors rather than limiting the factors to what you might have a hypothesis about or might have easy access to in terms of data. So intelligent forecasting in practice means doing things in a repeatable and scalable way so you can customize the forecast to reflect how you currently look at your business. In the past, the time and energy spent on modeling would only allow business really to only look at a few areas of the business, maybe those that have really large volume, right, the top drivers, or high margin to make it worth the time. But for the Office of Finance, I think intelligent forecasting means building predictive models at scale by different dimensions, like different categories or geographies that mirror how you really look at the business today. Each model is custom, it's unique, but the approach for building the model is similar enough to be repeatable and scalable to allow you to view the business through that predictive lens, no matter what part of the business you're looking at. So setting up the models is really only the start. While a traditional planning process that relies heavily on human assumptions and knowledge to start is essentially a stale product in a couple months, when the market shifts and conditions change or internal plans change, and you have to start all over. The benefit of a automated predictive model is that a properly set up driver-based model lives and breathes on for months or years at a time, and actually gets better over time as more data is being fed into it and the model updates and adapts to the new data being fed in. This allows, I think, for a more manageable rolling forecast process in finance, right? You're not starting from scratch every time, but you have models that are improving. The business may not change its plan every time the model updates with a new data point, but it opens the business up to the concept of continual refinement when you need it, and also monitoring business risk. Anytime that the business plan deviates too far from what the predictive model is suggesting, the planner can be warned and can react and change course if needed. An intelligent forecast is there when you need it, always taking in the most relevant information and sending alerts if projections are deviating too far from the internal business plans.
That's right, Andrew. And CFOs are starting to think differently about using technology in their forecasting. I mean, what's failed in the past is one problem is the data collection itself is time consuming and can be error prone. And because any planning process includes a negotiation process amongst managers and executives, most enterprises have fallen prey to sandbagging, hockey sticking forecasts, and other shortcomings. Those reduce overall management effectiveness and waste precious time and capital. And as you pointed out, Andrew, we now have the tools and the ability to automate and scale predictive modeling to the point where the ROI is clear on the use of global data, AI, and robust analytics. And that's thanks in large part to the elasticity of resources which the cloud provides. You mentioned rolling forecasts. Those have always been considered a best practice in many industries, but difficult to implement. I'd argue, too, that event-driven forecasting, if there's a large-scale storm, a virus or epidemic, or significant economic changes, rerunning the forecasting process can be very valuable. But under legacy technology, time-consuming and cost-prohibitive. So what's happening now with this technology, CFOs can begin to ask difficult questions, like what are the leading drivers?
Absolutely, and there's no longer can that question be repeated back by saying, well, that's too broad of a question, or how do we even begin to answer that? A lot of times people might say everything matters, or and therefore really nothing matters. How do we make this systematic? Well, this is how you approach it with machine learning, is you say everything could matter, right? And we don't limit ourselves to a hypothesis that narrows down the scope and the answer too quickly. We can say, let's test this, right? Let's take the scientific approach here and say, out of these thousands, if not millions of potential leading drivers, what actually matters most to my business? It could be that thousands of things matter to your business, but what are the top 5 things? What are the top 10 things, right? There are advanced analytics right now that can sift through millions of different combinations of leading and lagging factors to your business in a matter of minutes and give you some of those answers of what are the top drivers. This is how important questions are answered, by taking an unbiased approach and letting the data do the talking. And with, I think, a lot of the modern machine learning techniques, you can let the data talk a whole lot more than you ever could before.
So Andrew, that's great. And it's true. All of that objective external data can help provide guardrails around the forecasting process. And we talked earlier about sandbagging or hockey sticking forecasts. And at senior levels of management, they're often dependent on what they hear from the field and from middle managers as to what to expect. And now you're giving them tools that can put some guardrails around all that and help them to initiate a discussion if somebody's starting to push their leverage and negotiation a little too hard in the process.
Absolutely, and I think the best way to combat opinions and differing opinions at that is really to take the fact-based approach and find leading causal drivers that really bolster your case, right? It's not that I feel the market is going to improve. It's the fact that we have these 5 leading predictive drivers that are 95% accurate that are all rising right now and are signaling to my business that we're going to have opportunity, or conversely, that a market downturn is coming. So it's really about finding the right sets of data that really help explain business causals. And in what I want to talk about here is the fact that we can answer different types of questions. I think for the business, historically, it's been important to diagnose what went wrong, right? How did we miss a forecast? And a lot of that, you can use past data and try to understand what are the drivers that really caused my business to go up or down in the past and maybe miss, right? But then it's another thing to say, what's actually leading my business? What's going to help me forecast better in the future? And so this is where we introduce the concept in machine learning about looking at the time dimension, leading and lagging effects. And this is where external factors really thrive, right? When you're sitting in a market environment, you're not alone. There is a domino effect of different leading economic factors that have to happen first before somebody walks into your store and buys something, or a business decides to expand with you, right? These are called leading causal drivers. And there are many different macroeconomic factors like wages and consumer sentiment. The stock market watches these all the time. Well, guess what? These are also driving your business environment, and particularly it could be impacting your sales at some sort of offset, whether that's a 3 months, a 6 month, or 12-month offset. Best practices for businesses right now are to look at, isolate, and identify what are the key leading economic factors that are driving my business, and then build those into predictive models so that they're not just relying on past data, historic demand, and then trend extrapolating that into the future. That works when the market is stable, and if you're always growing at 4%, you pick 4%, right? You do great. But when the market is shifting, that's when you really need these leading causal drivers, because you want to see that if this 6-month leading indicator is starting to head down, you want to know that that's going to cause some pain for your business, and you want to react to that. And so using machine learning to identify not only what factors are important to your business, but what are the leading factors to your business is really a way to get advanced and predictive in this.
So Andrew, that sounds almost like the event-driven forecasting I was talking about, but even in the best practice described as event-driven forecasting, that's all happening after the event. What you're talking about is getting some insight into an event as it's developing.
Yeah, there are things you can predict and you can't predict, right? So when we think about different things like an election or even the global viruses, right? There are certain things that you might have to diagnose after the cause, right? It's really hard to predict the weather more than 2 weeks out in advance. However, there are many things out there, many different signals that do give you some leading probability of the direction of future business. You can look at things like inflation-adjusted hourly wages or new construction permits, right? And watch how those work their way through the economic cycle and then eventually impact your business. Now, we can't predict everything, but if you can identify 1, 2, 3, 4 different signals that statistically have turned ahead of your business, you're way ahead of your competitors by diagnosing that. And in utilizing machine learning to get to those answers is really the accelerant that businesses need in order to get there.
So there's definitely a balance to building that process. I mean, if I start thinking about how to begin, right, how to use these tools, one of my first questions would be, what data is out there?
Yeah, so the process, I think we want to get a little more concrete with the process, because a lot of times you can say utilize advanced machine learning, right, to to build out some forecasts, but how do you actually get there? So let's spend some time talking about the end-to-end process. So when I think about incorporating external factors in a systematic and repeatable way, I think the very first question is, what data is out there? And oftentimes this is a very daunting question, right? Because data comes from many different sources. So you have to go out there, gather that, maybe make some API connections through firewalls, port them into an internal business data lake. These can all be a very challenging thing. So I would suggest working with vendors and partners who have already done the legwork to go out and gather all this data. There are many out there. It's really about saying, hey, somebody went through the effort to go and gather all this data that could be important to me. Let's utilize their databases, even if it's, you know, a gathering of publicly available data, so that it's all there in one spot for me to utilize.
And Andrew, we've talked a lot about external data, but this could include internal data as well. Am I right?
Well, you need all your data in one spot ready for analysis, and that's the important thing. I think a lot of times the historic barriers to incorporating external factors into the forecasting process is that the entire forecasting process was built around just internal data. So internal systems, pulling in internal data, analyzing it, and building out your forecast that way. But when it came to external data, right, it sat in a different spot. Maybe the analysis was done ad hoc, and you had to, you know, go to different websites, download and look at it in separate spreadsheets. So it's really about the importance of having both your external and your internal data in a similar spot, ready, clean, staged, ready for analysis. So after we've explored what data is out there, and then we found a way to systematically gather that data, then the business has to ask which of these data sets is actually interesting and meaningful to the business. Now, I would recommend that this is where you start to take a scientific approach, apply machine learning in order to say, with some measure of probability or degree, that these are the indicators that statistically mean the most to my business and have historically predicted things in the past. But Patrick, I imagine that without having those sorts of tools to take that scientific approach, I imagine for CFOs, the idea of what external factors drive my business in the past may have felt arbitrary or the subject of opinion. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it was a combination of that, actually, Andrew. That if you look at the makeup of the typical CFO and the folks in their senior leadership, they've grown up through oftentimes the accounting ranks, right? And accountants love to see things tie out. They operate in a world of trial balances, and all the debits equal the credits. And unfortunately, when you're forecasting, that isn't always going to be the case. In fact, you may find 2 or 3 different sets of data that get you a close approximation to the thing you're estimating are more helpful than one Excel model that you can tie out to the penny that's missing the mark.
Yeah, I think I find that challenging sometimes when working with finance, is that you really have to set expectations that, hey, nobody is ever going to nail forecasting 100%. 100% accuracy is not the goal, right? It's really about improving the process, improving upon what we've previously done, getting slightly more accurate, slightly more intelligent about the process, because that's where incremental improvement will actually see a rate of return on it. Nobody's ever going to be 100% accurate at prognosticating the future, but don't throw out the predictive model the first time it goes, off, right? And it's to diagnose things a little bit more scientifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked earlier about some of the problems in the forecasting process, like hockey sticking. Well, hockey sticking happens because the people involved think that they have to hit a budget number by the end of the year. And while at different levels of the business operations, they may understand that the real world is different from what was budgeted, they try to kick the can down the road as far as they can, and then the forecast ends up looking like a hockey stick. There's an old adage in financial planning and analysis that the budget is what we want to have happen, and the forecast should be what we expect to happen. but in some cultures it's hard to deal with those as two different sets of priorities, right? We try to use the forecast to bolster our budget, even if the budget is no longer valid.
Right, and if you're trying to hockey stick or correct in any way in the forecast, right, then your forecast accuracy diminishes greatly over time because you're constantly trying to compound a problem, right? That it was a little off, and so I got to make up more, and I got to make up more the next month and the month after, can really lead to issues with, quantifiable expenses.
We had worked with a very large telco years ago that had over 1,000 people involved in the budgeting and forecasting process. And at the very end of the process every quarter, there was somebody sitting with a single Excel model and a handful of external data who was oftentimes more accurate than the results of the 1,000 people hammering away. And it was in large part for that reason, that the 1,000 people all were motivated to try to hit the budget.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great way to start the discussion on number 4, right? How do we incorporate these factors into the planning process? If external factors on their own, on the side, may sometimes be more accurate or may miss the mark, right? If there's an internal business plan that the business is trying to push to combat market factors. And so this is where things often break down in the intelligent forecasting process, in my opinion, is how do we actually systematically incorporate these external factors, which are more often than not right and valuable signals on what's going to happen in the market. How do you incorporate into the messy business planning, adapting, forecasting process that incorporates sales, marketing, all these different departments? And I think that's really where the value is met, right? The businesses that are successful incorporating these into the planning process in some sort of systematic way are the ones that end up finding the true value. Because it's one thing to identify a correlating factor, it's another one to say, this is actually going to be part of my process and I'm going to be able to change my actions. Because ultimately you could have 100% accurate forecast, but if you don't change business actions to meet the forecast, then it's all for naught. So there's many different ways, and maybe Patrick, you have some comments on best practice incorporating these factors.
Well, yeah, I think for almost every organization that looks at predictive modeling and the use of machine learning and forecasting, it's not going to be advantageous to jump in at the deep end of the pool, right? They're going to want to transition into it. And so even if you built highly reliable models that are very accurate, there's still a negotiation process in both budgeting and forecasting and management discussion. And so a good place to start is to use those predictive models as guardrails, as we talked about earlier, around the existing process, and to use those guardrails to tighten up the existing process and improve it and get a better discussion going. When markets seem to turn, or when there seems to be an inflection point in a trend, to be able to actually take the time to have the conversation at each level of management to get people to think about that and understand whether they want to revise forecasts or if they see it coming. Or have a better understanding because of the predictive models.
I really like the concept, the idea of guardrails. So because I think the best practices for companies are setting up these guardrails in a systematic way. So I want to talk about how companies today are improving the strategic forecasts for the CFO using our Prevedere predictive analytics cloud. As an example. So when we think about the end-to-end process, and we talked about kind of all the steps, right? This is where we developed here at Prevedere the Aaron Predictive Analytics Cloud to enable business analysts to systematically build predictive models that incorporate those external factors and feed them into the business planning process. So Aaron, E-R-I-N, stands for External Real-Time Insights. And the platform starts with a data repository of over 2.5 million external time series indicators from over thousands of different sources around the world. The idea here is that if there's some signal or clue out there that is influencing your business, we want to have it in one spot, ready for machine learning to identify this as a potential causal factor for your business. And then we want to marry that with your internal data in order to find what are the major impacting factors that are out there. So with the use of cloud computing, we can marry the external data with the internal company metrics to identify the best predictive indicators, and then utilize advanced algorithms to build and recommend predictive models that project probable future business performance. Now, this isn't the end of the story. This isn't the final forecast, right? These predictive models are essentially the guardrails that are going to help educate the Office of Finance to create the best final forecasts. So the models are often built using monthly external and internal data. Projections go to the horizon of the annual business planning cycle. So typically this is 12 to 18 months out to cover the current and the next fiscal year. And then the models are typically built and analyzed across the major geographies and categories that the CFO is already viewing the business through. This way, for every business plan, you have a parallel model that is the unbiased economic baseline from which to compare your internal plans to. CFO just utilize this output to inform their business forecasts and plans. Instead of just saying, what did we do last year and are we going to go up or going to go down? You can really say, hey, this is what the unbiased economic baseline model is predicting. Now let's say, are we going to execute to this? Are we going to overperform this model, or are we going to underperform, and why? It's way to quantify, again, put up those guardrails and say this is the economic constraints from which we're facing. Now, how are we going to go and above and beyond that? This starts to, I think, introduce the idea of economic risk, right? Is that when you have your final forecast and you also simultaneously have these advanced predictive models running, it's really in looking at the delta between the two that you start to systematically identify risk. Where is there risk in my business? If the predictive model is saying 5% growth, but I'm internally planning on 10% growth, well, how am I going to achieve 10% growth, right? How are we going to make up that 5 percentage point delta between the two? However, if I'm planning on 10% and the econometric model is suggesting 12%, well, maybe I have room to grow even more beyond 10%, right? And so the further away you get from the external factors and the historic predictive model, the more risk you're introducing into your forecasting plan, and the more that the CFO might want to look and alert and suggest different areas of the business where there's the highest amount of risk, and proactively go after those areas in order to adapt to the changing market conditions.
Well, that's right, Andrew. And all of that can inform a number of processes internally that finance can help to drive. If you think of the quarterly review process, having the results from the error and predictive analytics models inform that process would help the discussion greatly. Because otherwise it just waits on the close process and the internal forecasting process, and all the noise of the internal forecasting process tends to get in the way. I'd suggest too that the same models could be used for scenario analysis, right? You could flex some of these indicators to do a little bit of what if, and that could certainly be very valuable at the strategic planning and target setting phase even before budgeting. In a number of industries today, when I talk to board level management or board level representatives, one of the primary concerns is disruptive technology in their sector. And if you're leaving economic opportunity on the table in an up market, you're basically fueling those disruptors in your sector, right? And so getting a handle on where the market really is based on external factors and making sure that you're as profitable as you can be, it helps you retain a competitive advantage.
Absolutely. And I just think back to recent history in the past 12 months. There is a lot of conversation anecdotally about, when's the next recession going to come, right? And is it here? And I think businesses who may have planned too conservatively over the past 12 months left opportunities on the table because they might have been listening to some of the talk and rhetoric that, hey, it's been 10 years since the last recession, we're kind of due. But if they've been watching their internal indicators, they would have seen a different story about opportunities for growth. And so it's really about driving your business plans in a data reality, right? That hey, if these predictors have shown me the last 2 or 3 downturns and they're all going up right now, well, that should give us the courage to be aggressive in our plans and take advantage of opportunities, and then vice versa, right? If the signals are going down, to really pull back, and that can oftentimes businesses are tripped up at the top of the peak of the market when they feel like they're invincible. That's when their leading indicators could be showing some negative signals, and if they're not paying attention, they could get caught off guard. So I have a couple of examples from customers about incorporating predictive analytics into the planning process. The first is a leading alcoholic beverage manufacturer that really started to lean on predictive analytics when certain categories of the business were starting to look in trouble. Oftentimes, this is when you start raising those red flags, is only once the business has been in the middle of a downturn. So after a few years of pretty steady and solid growth, the market was suddenly slowing, and not only in their business, but in their competitors as well. So they couldn't just point internally. They started to say there must be something going wrong with the broader market. So the finance department really at this time had more questions than answers, and started looking to software solutions, consultants to answer these questions. Everything from, is it the legalization of marijuana that's impacting our business, to changing Hispanic preferences, to the impact of dry January, or perhaps the move towards online shopping instead of in-store shopping. These were all questions that were on the table, but not necessarily quantified at that point. And so they started exploring these questions, utilizing Prevedere's combination of millions of external data, machine learning, to really help answer what was truly driving the business. And they were able to uncover some of the top drivers over the past 12 months that were signaling the downturn through models that they built and back tests that they performed, said that, hey, we would have been able to see this downturn coming. But importantly, what we did was we helped them take those same leading indicators and start timing the recovery, right? They were concerned that this was a downturn that was going to last quarter after quarter, and we were able to identify what were the top leading signals, and when those signals were starting to turn, when that was going to mean a recovery for their business. So now they've taken that kind of data-driven, intelligent forecasting approach and started applying it to other categories of their business and other geographies. And they're actually looking across 40 different categories and looking outside the U.S. where they started asking those questions.
Well, Andrew, that's fascinating. But what about non-consumer facing products?
Yeah, so this works not only for consumer facing, but also for B2B companies. We find a lot of success in identifying leading indicators. So one example we have is a drainage pipe manufacturer that was suffering from poor forecast accuracy for years. So despite having an SOP process, plans were constantly off due to unchecked optimism from the sales team input, something, Patrick, you mentioned as being a perpetual problem across many businesses. Or even expectation settings from the top that were just too optimistic, that ended up being not realistic given the market conditions. Weather was often to blame, right? They installed drainage, or they sell drainage pipe to installers, and so a natural excuse, right, for missed performance could be the weather. But year after year, missing forecasts, if something didn't add up. So in reality, everyone knew that there was more to blame, and that there was this time-consuming S&OP process with not delivering accurate forecasts costing the company money through excess inventory and shipping costs, and something needed to be done. Well, they started incorporating machine learning to identify systematically what are the key drivers, build data-driven predictive models that were unbiased and increase forecast accuracy, and then said, hey, let's start there and justify our plans only surrounding by what those leading predictive drivers were telling us. So that became the baseline for the S&OP process and really helped the company deliver much better consensus forecasts that were grounded in some form of reality. So I think in both the case of the B2B manufacturer of drainage pipe and the spirits company, both cases, I think machine learning was really used as a force multiplier that helped them create more accurate plans.
Thank you both. I always like getting into the examples where we can of different industries. It's always fascinating to me, and touching on the different opportunities clients are learning about. And the concept of an unbiased addition to the planning process through machine learning, I think is really important, and I like that we're using that word. Seeing as machine learning really is a force multiplier in finance, Patrick, as someone who works with CFOs, who is a CFO, where can you imply intelligent forecasting as a force multiplier concept?
Well, let's start, as we did earlier, with the strategic planning process and the development of targets. Those drive the budgeting process, right? And we can drastically improve the scope of scenarios considered and the range of external data that's used in that process. At the corporate level, remember the 1,000 planning professionals at the telco I mentioned? Well, improving that process with a more formalized corporate modeling capability not only improved accuracy, but drove efficiency in the process. We didn't need 1,000 people any longer in that process. They could be redeployed into other areas and still have a better budget and a better forecast. At the business unit level, we can not only efficiently employ a finer level of granularity to the data and the forecasting models that are used for decision making, but we can get a clearer and more objective discussion going in that negotiation processing. And brand managers working with marketing are already keenly aware of the predictive modeling value, and they're hungry for faster and more efficient tools. So what I see Prevedere bringing to the table there is a translation of what marketing has always known into the Office of Finance, and giving the finance professionals comparable tools and capabilities. And as we mentioned earlier, when we implement predictive modeling as guardrails in the process, we establish a mitigating control to anticipate inflection points, whether those are upward trending or downward trending inflection points. So I jump then to the annual S&OP process and talk about what headwinds and tailwinds can do to that process. Andrew, what have you seen in applying predictive forecasting in this area?
The big thing to me is that using predictive dynamic models really helps stop linear thinking. So in the S&OP process, typically the starting blocks are what's happened last quarter, last year, right? And then the team builds off of that. And once you start to incorporate external factors and changing market dynamics, all of a sudden that linear thinking starts to go away, and you start looking for when is my market going to be disrupted, and then what am I doing to plan for that? And rather than saying that the negative markets are always going to be negative and the positive ones are always going to be positive. So it really starts to change the dialogue, the dynamic of that process by starting with a better baseline. The other thing that predictive analytics can really do is start treating different regions that your business plays in as different. Right, is when we're looking at the Southeast, we shouldn't be thinking about in the same market dynamics as the Midwest or the Northwest, right? They have different changing demographics, different economic factors, and maybe traditionally you just looked historically and said, oh, the South is going to do good because of population growth, and the Northeast is going to be weaker because of the demographics there. But you don't have to have those assumptions continue on forever, right? You can understand when the Northeast is going to be stronger, when the South is going to underperform, and look at the different market dynamics custom to the different areas. And I think that really adds to the intelligence of people in understanding and knowing their specific markets that they're responsible for.
And Andrew, this is where applying a finer level of detail in the analysis helps too. That ability to scale because of cloud computing can get us down, to areas like SMSAs, which marketing is always used, even down to branch or store level for some. We had worked with a client years ago. They were in the greeting card business and had hundreds of stores all over the country, and had developed a generalized model, but you can imagine that performance was significantly different. There was actually a store between 3 subway lines in New York City, so actually underground in the subway system, between 3 subway lines and a large area of offices, and that store produced sales that were 10 times the generalized model that the manufacturer had, and so they just in a spreadsheet-based environment, they just didn't have the capability to do that level of analysis at that final level of detail. But now, certainly with Aaron and the capabilities Prevedere brings to bear, we can get a much finer lens on what the drivers are.
Right. We no longer have to treat every unique business, geography, category, channel of the business as just the law of averages, right? You can start to understand and appreciate why the overperformers are overperforming, or why certain markets and categories are underperforming based off of the unique external factors that are presented in that area.
Yeah, look at real estate. I mean, certainly what's happening in real estate at the very high end of the market over the last 18 months or so has been significantly different from trends more broadly within the sector, and we see that in almost every sector.
Yeah, and so I think what ties this all together is the idea that the CFO, through predictive analytics, is going to be able to look at different divisions of their business, at different geography of their business, and really be able to focus on the ones that are in trouble. And so we want to close today by showing you a couple examples of how executives are systematically utilizing predictive analytics in their planning process. And so this is the idea of an economic risk dashboard. And so what you're looking at here is not one forecast for every geography and category, but 2 forecasts. One is the internal business plan that is locked in stone, everybody's executing on, right? And the business is going to be judged against. And in each of these, it's compared to the unbiased economic predictive baseline model from Prevedere. And so what we're looking at here across the different geographies is we're looking for the executive to identify areas of risk. And so that you can set a risk threshold. This one's set to 5% when you look at the upper panel of the chart, right? And what it's saying is that if my internal business plan deviates from the economic conditions by 5% or greater, and that can be above or below, right, then right, because this is an at-risk market. I'm expecting something that is not probable or likely to come true based off of economic conditions. This allows you to scan multiple geographies, multiple categories, and say it can be reassuring when you're looking at consumer goods in China and saying, okay, this market is our plan is sound, and we're going to execute off this plan, and economic conditions are not going to throw our plan awry. But if we look at something like Brazil construction, what we see is that our expectations are much too high, that we are expecting something that's just not realistic given the weak conditions that are going on in the Brazil construction market. And so therefore, we should be focusing our energy and effort there. Maybe that's a double down on marketing, or maybe it's pulling back in a region because we're just not going to maintain the margin or hit the volume that we were expecting. So it's about systematically looking at the entire business, building out predictive models, and then being alerted to when those predictive models suggest something different than what the business came up with as an original plan.
And Andrew, just to be clear to the finance professionals with us today, this isn't a replacement for what a lot of FP&A folks are familiar with for collecting forecasts or collecting budgets and reviewing and approving and rolling them up according to a hierarchy, right? Those systems can gather actual budget and forecast data and provide some control over the submission process and the translation of currencies and some simple arithmetic. But what you're offering here is a really powerful tool that can sit alongside that and compare that internal roll-up of budgets and forecasts to what's going on in the real world, and to do it at a level of detail where you can actually see if there's risk and a meaningful way to react to that risk or mitigate that risk, either country by country or region by region, or, as we said earlier, category by category. It's fantastic.
Yeah, exactly. This does not replace what the CFO has historically looked at in the past, right? And all the different roll-ups, but it's going to say, hey, where are these plans not realistic, right? Where are we likely to see a deviation from our plan, so that you can focus action and attention there. And so while we have this view of saying, okay, where is there risk? The next question is why? Why is there risk? And so the nice part about building out predictive models, utilizing Prevedere that are driver-based, is that you can start to answer the question of why. Why are market conditions not going to meet my expectations? And so that's where you drill down, and you can drill into any one of these predictive models and look and compare. This is what my plan is. This is what the predictive model suggests, and these are the factors that are pushing up or down that predictive model. So you can get a better understanding of what are the leading factors that really mean something to my business, what are those doing today, and how is that going to impact my business performance plans, and where am I going to fall short, right? Or where am I leaving opportunity on the table because market conditions are changing? So it really can be a powerful way to be data-driven, to validate plans, and also estimate risk, right? To where are we not likely going to meet expectations, to point the company in the right direction to try to handle some of those problems.
So I'm thinking, if I'm participating in today's webinar, I want to know where to go next. How do I find out more? This looks fantastic. Nicole, do you have any answers for us?
I do, actually. Thank you both. A sincere thank you to both of you. And we don't want to leave anyone hanging, so thank you for listening to the discussion. I feel like all of the insights here on the evolving role the CFO plays and how CFOs are empowered and are using this technology throughout their organizations was pivotal. So if there are any questions from anyone joining us, please feel free to reach out to any of our speakers with questions. Use the email that you see here, and I will ensure that everybody gets a follow-up reply. We really enjoy working with our clients and prospects, and we invite you to take us up on this offer and send us any questions you may have. Thank you both again for joining us today.